The forest was alive with strange night sounds. Low growls, distant bird-like calls, and the rustle of wind through thick alien leaves. Evan moved silently between the tall trees, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. He'd been checking his traps all evening, hoping for a good catch. Out here on this wild colony world, meat and pelts were worth more than credits in the nearest settlement. As he approached his third snare, a strange sound reached him. Not the frantic rustle of an animal, but a sharp, panicked cry. He froze, listening. Another cry followed, higher pitched and desperate. He moved quickly, pushing through thick ferns until the trap came into view. It was a net suspended between two trees, the rope trembling under the weight of something, or someone. Evan's breath caught. It wasn't a wild animal. The figure tangled in the net was a girl, Mom, but not human. Her skin had a faint silvery hue that caught the moonlight, and strange dark markings curled along her cheeks and arms. Her hair was long, black and tangled, her eyes glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. She thrashed in the net, hissing, and speaking in a language he didn't understand. He raised his hands slowly. Easy. Easy now, I'm not going to hurt you. She bared her teeth, pulling against the ropes harder, her movements wild with fear. Evan could see where the rope was cutting into her skin. He stepped closer and she flinched like a trapped animal. You're going to hurt yourself if you keep doing that, he said softly, though he knew she couldn't understand. He pulled a small knife from his belt and moved toward the net. Her eyes widened and she pressed back against the ropes, her voice rising in alarm. Hey, he said quickly, keeping his tone calm. Not for you, for the ropes. Her gaze darted to the knife, then back to his face. She was trembling, from fear, exhaustion, or both. Evan worked quickly, cutting the ropes near the top. The net loosened and she dropped to the ground with a small gasp. She tried to scramble away, but her legs gave out. He crouched beside her, setting the knife aside. You're hurt, he murmured. Let me help. She stared at him with wide, suspicious eyes. Her breathing was fast, shallow. He could feel the tension rolling off her. She truly believed he was dangerous. Evan glanced around. The forest was no place to linger, not at night. He could hear distant howls, low and echoing. Predators. All right, he said, more to himself than to her. He slipped an arm under her shoulders, lifting her gently. She tensed at his touch, but didn't fight, maybe too tired to resist. Carried her through the trees, his cabin not far now. The small structure was simple, a single room with a stove, a bed, and shelves lined with supplies. He set her down near the fire, careful to keep his movements slow. She looked around warily, her gaze flicking to the door, the window, the tools on the wall. When his hand brushed a kettle, she flinched again. You think I'm going to eat you, he said quietly, realizing what the fear in her eyes meant. I'm not. Of course, the words meant nothing to her. He poured water into a cup and set it near her. She didn't touch it. He opened a ration pack, placing it beside the cup. Still, she didn't move. Suit yourself, he muttered, taking a sip of his own water. The firelight cast soft shadows on her face. Her eyes never left him, sharp and unblinking. But beneath the fear, there was something else. Curiosity. When the night deepened and the forest grew quiet, Evan sat across from her, sharpening his knife. Her gaze followed every movement, but her body had eased slightly. Somewhere between the crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of his hands, the fear in her eyes began to shift, and just a little. The fire crackled softly in the cabin, filling the silence with a steady rhythm. Outside, the alien forest whispered in the night wind, but inside, the only sounds were the occasional pop from the burning wood and the faint rustle when the girl shifted her position. Evan had given her space. She sat on the floor near the far wall, her knees drawn up, one hand resting protectively over her side. He could see faint rope marks on her wrists where the net had dug in. He wanted to treat them, but he knew that if he rushed her, she might panic again. He decided to start small. He picked up the kettle from the fire, poured steaming water into a cup, and mixed in a small portion of dried herbs. The scent filled the cabin, calming, earthy. He took a sip himself, then set the cup down within her reach. She eyed it like it might bite her. "It's not poison," he said softly, though he knew she wouldn't understand. He gestured toward it, then pointed to himself and mimed drinking. Again. Her eyes narrowed, but after a long pause, she reached out slowly, her movements cautious. She sniffed the steam, then took the smallest sip imaginable. Her expression didn't change, but she didn't spit it out either. "Good," Evan said, a hint of relief in his voice. Next, he tried food. He pulled a small pan from the shelf and cooked a strip of meat over the fire, letting the rich smell fill the air. Her gaze flicked to it, then quickly away, as if she didn't want him to know she was interested. When he placed the food near her, she hesitated even longer than with the tea, but hunger had a way of breaking walls. She finally picked it up, sniffed it, and took a cautious bite. For the first time since he found her, she looked less tense, not relaxed, not yet, but something in her shoulders loosened. Evan took the chance to try talking again. He tapped his chest. "Evan," he said slowly, pointing to himself. She tilted her head. "Evan," he repeated. She studied him for a moment, then spoke a word in her own language. Soft, lilting, but nothing, he recognized. She pointed at herself. He nodded. "Your name?" She pointed again, repeating the word. "Sarah." "Sarah," he said carefully. Her eyes softened, just slightly. She pointed at him. "Evan." He smiled. "Progress." The hours passed slowly, but the tension between them shifted in small ways. Evan showed her some of the tools in the cabin, not as weapons, but as things for work. He mimed setting a snare, then fixing it. She watched closely, her sharp eyes tracking every movement. At one point he noticed her glancing at the door. She wasn't just looking, she was studying the lock, the hinges, the way out. He understood then. She was still thinking about escape, but she didn't move toward it. When the night grew deep, Evan laid out a blanket for her near the fire. She didn't take it at first, but when he turned away, she pulled it over her shoulders. Next morning, Evan woke early. The cabin was quiet except for the sound of water boiling. Sarah was awake, sitting cross-legged, her eyes scanning the room. She didn't flinch when he moved this time. He offered her more food, a small loaf of bread from his supplies. She took it without hesitation, though she still kept her gaze fixed on him. After breakfast, he tried again to communicate. He drew a rough map on a piece of scrap wood, the cabin, the forest, the river nearby. She leaned closer, curious. With a piece of charcoal, she added marks of her own, winding paths, strange symbols he didn't recognize. He pointed to one and raised his eyebrows. She touched the mark and said a word, low and quick, then mimed a running motion, glancing over her shoulder as if something chased her. Evan frowned. "Danger?" She nodded. That single exchange told him more than anything else so far. She hadn't just been wandering when she got caught in his trap. She'd been running from something. When their eyes met again, there was still fear there. But it was different now. Not the wild panic of the first night. It was guarded caution, the kind a person keeps for someone they're not sure they can trust. But maybe, just maybe, they want to. Evan studied the symbols Sarah had drawn on the scrap wood. They were uneven but deliberate, twisting lines that marked rivers, clusters of small shapes for hills, and strange jagged marks that he guessed meant danger. One mark stood out, drawn with heavier strokes as if she wanted to make sure he noticed it. He tapped it. "This?" Sarah's expression darkened. She said a word, slow and low, and then mimed a shape with her hands. Long claws, wide jaws. Her voice lowered to a growl. "Animal," Evan guessed. "Predator." She nodded once, her eyes sharp. Then she mimed running, glancing over her shoulder, just like before. Evan leaned back. So you weren't just wandering, you were running from one of these things. Sarah didn't understand the words, but she seemed to understand his tone. She pointed toward the forest beyond the cabin wall, then to herself, then spread her hands as if searching. Your people, he said. Her gaze lifted to meet his, and for the first time he saw something besides fear, worry. They're out there, he guessed. And you got separated. She pressed her lips together and gave a small nod. Evan sighed. He'd been planning to keep her here only until she could leave safely on her own. But now, looking at the map, he realized there was nothing safe about the forest she'd have to cross. Those things, he said, pointing at the jagged mark again. How many? Sarah held up 2 fingers, then tapped the mark twice. He didn't know if that meant there were 2 of them or 2 groups, but either way, it was bad news. He thought about his traps, snares, trip lines, spike pits. They were enough to catch game, but not enough for something that could chase a hunter for miles. Sarah must have sensed his unease. She pointed to herself, then to him, then drew a line between the cabin and another part of the map where she made a small cluster of circles. That's where you think they are? He asked. She nodded quickly, almost urgently. Evan looked at her, at the faint rope marks still on her wrists, at the way she held herself ready to move at any second. She'd been running for who knew how long before his trap caught her. If she was desperate enough to ask a human stranger for help, it meant the danger was worse than she'd let on. He stood, grabbing his gear pack from the wall. All right, I'll take you. Sarah's eyes widened, not in fear this time, but in surprise. She pointed to him, then to the door, as if asking if he was serious. Yeah, he said, but you're going to have to help me too. I don't know this forest the way you do. A faint smile flickered across her face, the first he'd seen. It was small and cautious, but it was there. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Evan checked his traps, taking what could be carried easily. Sarah moved through the cabin quickly, scanning supplies like someone who knew how to travel light. She selected only a small water flask, a coil of rope, and a few tools. Before nightfall, they stepped outside. The forest air was cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and something faintly sweet from flowering plants in the distance. The canopy overhead glowed with the last traces of daylight. Sarah led, moving with quiet confidence. Evan followed, his crossbow slung over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the shadows. They traveled in silence for hours until the forest grew darker and the sounds changed. The light chirps of small animals faded, replaced by low, distant calls. Sarah froze, raising her hand. Evan stopped. From far off, a deep, guttural roar rolled through the trees. It wasn't like anything he'd heard before. Not a bear, not a cat, not anything from Earth. The sound was layered, almost vibrating through the ground. Sarah's jaw tightened. She pointed toward a ridge ahead, making a circling motion with her finger. You want to go around, he guessed. She nodded. They moved quietly, but the roars came again, closer now. Evan could feel the hair on his arms stand up. Whatever was out there was hunting. When they finally stopped for the night, they found a small hollow under the roots of an enormous tree. Evan set a small heat lamp, shielding the light with a cloth. Sarah sat across from him, her gaze scanning the dark. For a long time, neither spoke. But when Evan finally lay back against his pack, he noticed she hadn't looked afraid in the same way as when he'd first found her. She was still wary. Yes, but now some of that watchfulness was for him too. She wasn't just guarding herself anymore, she was guarding both of them. The forest at dawn was a mix of silver mist and soft light filtering through the canopy. The air was cool and heavy with the scent of wet earth. Evan stirred awake to find Sarah already up, crouched near the edge of their shelter beneath the massive tree roots. She was studying the ground, her fingers brushing over faint impressions in the soil. When she saw him watching, she motioned for him to come closer. She pointed to a set of claw marks etched into the dirt, long, deep, and fresh. Varric? Evan asked, remembering the jagged danger mark on her map. She nodded once, her expression serious. Then she made a sweeping motion toward the west. suggesting they move quickly in the opposite direction. Evan packed their gear in silence. As they moved, he noticed Sarah didn't just walk. She moved like the forest itself was her ally. She knew which branches would creak underfoot and which vines could be used to climb or swing over obstacles. When a section of ground looked unstable, she'd test it with a light step before signaling him to cross. By midday, they reached a narrow river. The water shimmered under the light, but Evan knew from experience that clear water didn't always mean safe water. Before he could stop her, Sarah knelt by the bank, scooping some into her hands. "Hey," he started, but she shook her head and pointed upstream. There, hidden by reeds, was a small plant with long, thin leaves. She plucked one, crushed it between her fingers, and dipped it into the water. The leaves changed color and she made a face, a clear sign it wasn't safe to drink. "You can tell that just from a plant?" Evan asked, half impressed, half baffled. She tapped the side of her head with a small, knowing smile, then motioned for him to follow her further upstream. They found a small pool fed by a thin waterfall. "Here?" Sarah repeated the test and the leaves stayed green. She filled both their flasks without a word. As they drank, Evan studied her more closely. She wasn't the same terrified girl who had been tangled in his trap. There was confidence in her movements now, a quiet assurance in how she navigated danger. Later, when they stopped to rest, Evan set up a small perimeter with trip lines. Nothing fancy, just a warning system. Sarah watched, tilting her head, then stepped in to adjust one of the lines. She repositioned the trigger branch so it would snap louder and faster. "Better," she said, her accent thick but the word clear. Evan raised an eyebrow. "You're learning fast." She gave a small shrug, but there was a hint of pride in her eyes. They continued through the afternoon, moving toward the cluster of circles she'd drawn on the map. Evan guessed that was where her people might be hiding, though she hadn't said it outright. Every so often she'd glance back at him, as if checking he was keeping up. Not because she thought he'd slow her down, but because she was making sure he was still there. Near sunset, they reached a ridge that overlooked a wide stretch of forest. Smoke curled faintly from somewhere in the distance, and too far to smell, but enough for Sarah to spot instantly. She crouched low, pointing to it with urgency. "Your people?" Evan asked. She hesitated, then nodded slowly. Her eyes were filled with something between hope and fear. But before they could plan their next move, a deep, rolling growl echoed from below the ridge. It was close, much closer than either of them liked. Evan's hand went to his crossbow. Sarah's eyes darted toward the sound, her body tense but not frozen. She whispered something in her own language, then motioned for him to follow her along a narrow ledge that wrapped around the ridge. They moved quickly, the growl following, sometimes fading, sometimes suddenly closer again. Evan realized Sarah wasn't running blindly. She was leading them toward a path that would take them downwind, masking their scent. When they finally stopped, hidden in a dense cluster of roots and vines, Evan let out a slow breath. "You know this place better than anyone." Sarah's gaze softened, and for the first time she said his name, Evan, without hesitation. It wasn't just the sound of her voice that struck him. It was the way she said it, without fear, without suspicion, just trust. And in that moment he knew that whatever came next, they weren't just two strangers surviving the same forest anymore. They were starting to move as one. Night fell fast in the alien forest, swallowing the colors and leaving only shadows and shifting shapes. Evan and Sarah made camp in a hollow between two large boulders, the walls of rock giving them cover on three sides. Evan kept the fire small, its glow hidden behind a makeshift screen of branches. Sarah sat across from him, her gaze scanning the dark tree line. She was restless tonight, her body tense like a bowstring. "You hear something?" Evan asked quietly. She didn't answer in words. Instead, she pointed toward the forest and made a slow clawing motion with her hand. Her eyes locked on his. Varix. The distant growl came a heartbeat later, low, vibrating through the ground. Evan's muscles tensed. It was the same sound he'd heard before, but closer now, more certain. The predator had picked up their trail. Sarah stood, moving to the perimeter line they'd set earlier. She crouched low, her hands checking the tension in the tripwires. Evan moved to help, his crossbow slung over his shoulder. Another growl came, followed by the sound of heavy footfalls. "They're hunting together," Evan muttered. Sarah gave a sharp nod, her eyes narrowing. She pointed, to one side of the camp, then to him, and then motioned for herself to take the other. They were splitting their defense. Evan positioned himself behind one of the boulders, loading a bolt into his crossbow. His heart beat slow and heavy in his chest. He knew he had only one real advantage: the traps he carried in his pack. The first sign of movement was a flicker in the undergrowth. Then a massive shape emerged, all sinew and muscle under mottled, scale-like skin, its eyes glowing faint amber in the low light. Its head was broad, its jaws lined with serrated teeth. The Varric moved low, its movement silent for something so large. Evan's finger tightened on the trigger. The snap of a tripwire echoed through the camp. A weighted net dropped from above, entangling the predator's front legs. It let out a deafening roar, thrashing wildly. Evan fired. The bolt struck deep into its shoulder, but the creature barely slowed. On the other side of the camp, another roar erupted. Sarah sighed. Evan turned in time to see her leap aside as a second Varric lunged, its claws raking the dirt where she'd stood. She moved fast, grabbing a rope from her belt and swinging it with practiced precision. The rope looped around the beast's jaws, tightening as she pulled, forcing its mouth shut. Evan didn't think. He grabbed a smoke flare from his pack, lit it, and hurled it toward the trapped Varric. The thick, acrid smoke poured into the air, disorienting the beast. It shook its head violently, its roars muffled by the rope. The first Varric tore free from the net, charging toward Evan. He dove aside, grabbing another trap, a spring-loaded spike board, and slamming it into place between them. The beast stepped forward and the spikes drove into its front leg, making it recoil with a sharp bellow. Sarah, still wrestling with the second Varric, shouted something in her language, urgent, commanding. Evan didn't understand the words, but he caught the meaning. "Now!" He reloaded, aimed for the first Varric's neck, and fired. This time, the bolt hit deep enough to make it stagger. Sarah yanked hard on the rope, twisting her predator's head to the side, and Evan moved in to strike. A final bolt sank into the beast's chest and it collapsed in a shuddering heap. The second, realizing the fight had turned, tore free from Sarah's hold and bounded back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The forest fell silent again, except for the ragged sound of their breathing. Evan lowered his crossbow, his hand still trembling from the adrenaline. He turned to Sarah. "You all right?" She nodded, but her expression was different now. She wasn't just relieved. She was looking at him in a way she hadn't before, not as a stranger, not as a possible threat, but as someone who had stood his ground for her even when he didn't have to. She stepped closer, her voice low. "Evan," she said, and there was a weight to the way she spoke his name, a kind of respect that didn't need translation. For a moment, neither moved. The fire crackled quietly, and somewhere in the forest, a branch snapped under the weight of something retreating. Whatever came next, Evan knew one thing for certain. She trusted him now, and that trust would matter more than anything in the days ahead. The Varric's body lay still, its scaled hide glistening in the faint firelight. Evan wiped the sweat from his brow, reloading his crossbow out of habit, even though the immediate danger had passed. Sarah crouched beside the beast for a moment, touching its side as if confirming it would not rise again. When she looked at him, her eyes were steady. She pointed to the smoke on the horizon they'd seen earlier. Then she touched her chest, then his, and drew a line through the air. "A clear sign, we go now," Evan nodded. "All right, let's find your people." They moved quickly, packing their gear in minutes. Sarah led, weaving through narrow animal trails and rocky passes with a speed that surprised him. She barely glanced back, trusting he would keep up. Evan noticed she no longer moved like someone running away. She moved like someone on a mission. By midday, the forest began to change. The trees grew thicker, their twisted roots forming natural walls and narrow corridors. The sounds here were different too. Fewer birds, more distant rustles that faded as they approached. Sarah stopped suddenly, crouching low. She pointed ahead where faint tracks marked the dirt. Smaller than the Variks, but still too large to be human. She made a motion of something walking on four legs, then tapped the ground twice. Two more of them. Evan guessed quietly. She nodded, her jaw tight. Instead of turning back, she began moving in a wide circle, carefully, avoiding the tracks. Hours later, they reached a clearing where the smoke rose thick and dark. At first, Evan thought it was a campfire. Then he saw the broken shelters, scattered belongings, and claw marks ripped deep into the wood. Sarah froze, her breath catching. She moved slowly through the wreckage, calling softly in her language. No answer came. Evan followed, scanning for movement, his crossbow ready. Near the edge of the clearing, they found signs of a struggle: blood, crushed grass, and more of the deep claw marks. Sarah crouched, touching the ground with trembling fingers. Her voice wavered as she spoke, but Evan couldn't understand the words. He knelt beside her. "What is it?" She looked up, her eyes shining with urgency. She mimed walking, then pointed toward the north. Then she held her wrists together like they were bound. "They took them," Evan said, realization hitting hard. She nodded once, sharply. Evan's mind raced. If the Variks had her people, they'd be kept alive only as long as it suited the predators. He didn't know if these creatures fed immediately or dragged prey to a den, but either way, time was short. "Then we go after them," he said. Sarah's gaze searched his face, as if to see if he was truly willing. When she saw he meant it, she gave a single resolute nod. They followed the tracks north, moving as fast as they could without making too much noise. The sun dipped low, and the shadows grew long. By the time the first stars appeared, they reached a rocky slope that led to a narrow cave entrance. From inside came the low rumbling growls of the Variks. Evan could make out the faint flicker of movement deeper within, too far to see clearly. Sarah pointed to herself, then to the far side of the entrance. She pointed to him and then to the near side. It was a simple plan. 2 sides, 1 strike. Evan checked his gear. 2 bolts left in his crossbow, 1 smoke flare, and a small coil of rope. Not much, but enough if they moved fast. At her signal, they crept into position. The Variks were inside, pacing near a crude enclosure of fallen logs and rock where several figures huddled. Sarah's people, their silver-toned skin catching faint glimmers of light. Evan's pulse quickened. He glanced across the entrance to where Sarah crouched, her rope ready. She met his eyes, and for a moment, there was no fear there at all, and only trust. Then she moved. Sarah moved like a shadow along the far side of the cave entrance, her rope looped and ready. Evan stayed low on his side, crossbow raised. The growls inside were steady, almost lazy, the sound of predators confident in their control. From his position, Evan could see the crude enclosure clearly now. Several alien figures huddled inside, their silver-toned skin marked with bruises and dirt. Most were older or younger, too weak to fight. One of them lifted their head just enough to see Sarah, and their eyes widened in recognition. Evan took a slow breath, waiting for her signal. Sarah's hand rose, 3 fingers extended. She folded them down one by one. On 0, she darted forward, flinging the rope in a perfect arc. It looped around the neck of the nearest Varik, and she yanked hard, pulling it off balance. The beast roared in shock, claws scraping the stone. Evan fired immediately. The bolt struck deep into the creature's side, and it stumbled, thrashing against the rope. Before the second Varik could react, Evan lit his last smoke flare and rolled it across the cave floor. Thick, stinging smoke filled the air, making the predators snarl and blink. Sarah leapt onto a boulder, pulling her rope tighter. The Varik fought wildly, but its movements were slower now, disoriented by the smoke. Evan reloaded, aiming for the second beast. The shot hit just below its shoulder, forcing it to retreat toward the back of the cave. The trapped villagers seized the moment, One of the older men kicked open a weak section of the enclosure, helping the others scramble free. Sarah shouted, quick commands in her language guiding them toward the exit. Evan backed toward the entrance, firing another bolt to keep the second Varric at bay. It lunged once, snapping its jaws, but the combined smoke, injury, and chaos kept it from charging fully. When the last of Sarah's people made it out, she released the rope and ran for the exit, Evan right behind her. They didn't stop until they were deep in the forest, the cave far behind them. Only then did they slow. The rescued group collapsed in relief, some hugging Sarah, others speaking rapidly in voices thick with emotion. Evan stood a little apart, catching his breath, his crossbow still in hand. He felt their eyes on him, wary at first, then softening as Sarah spoke to them. She pointed to him, said his name, and whatever she told them made several of them bow their heads slightly in respect. One of the younger villagers stepped forward, offering Evan a carved wooden charm shaped like a leaf. He accepted it without fully understanding, but the weight of it in his palm felt like more than just a token. It was a sign that he was no longer just an outsider. They traveled together for 2 days to reach a hidden valley where the rest of Sarah's tribe had taken shelter. The valley was quiet, sheltered by cliffs, with fresh water and thick forest for cover. When they arrived, Sarah's people greeted her with joy, though the relief was tempered by the losses they'd suffered. Evan kept to the background, not wanting to intrude, but Sarah sought him out before nightfall. She found him by the edge of the valley, looking out at the fading light. "You stay?" she asked, her voice careful but clear. Evan glanced back at the campfires, the quiet murmur of her people, and then at her. "If you want me to." She nodded, stepping closer. "Safe. Here. With us." There was no fear in her eyes now, only certainty. The girl he had once found tangled in his trap, trembling and convinced he meant her harm, now stood beside him as an equal. Evan smiled faintly. "All right, I'll stay." She reached into her pouch and pulled out a thin braided cord. At the end was a small piece of polished stone, deep green and smooth to the touch. She pressed it into his hand. "For you," she said simply. He didn't need a translation. That night, Evan sat by the fire with Sarah's people, sharing food and listening to their stories. The forest was still dangerous. The Varrics were still out there. But he knew now that he wouldn't face it alone. And somewhere in the quiet between the crackle of flames and the distant calls of night creatures, he realized that what had begun as fear had turned into something far stronger. Trust, and maybe even the beginning of something neither of them had expected.